Today we're going to talk about a special quadrilateral called a parallelogram. So we have a picture of a parallelogram down here, parallelogram ABCD, and this is the symbol that we can use to notate that this is a parallelogram if we're writing this out in sentences. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify the properties of a parallelogram and mark them on this picture. So the first property that we should address is that the opposite sides are congruent. Opposite sides are congruent. So that means AB and DC are congruent, and AD and BC are congruent. So we could write that in here as well. AB is congruent to DC, and AD is congruent to BC. Now notice that they're not congruent to each other, that AB and AD are not necessarily congruent to each other. The next property is that the opposite sides are also parallel. So AB is parallel to DC. And remember, we can draw this little arrow on our lines to show that those lines are parallel. So AB is parallel to DC. And then we also have AD is parallel to BC. So the reason I'm drawing two arrows on these sides is to show that they're parallel to each other, just like how with the same thing with tick marks, where anything that has one tick mark is congruent to each other, and anything that has two tick marks is congruent to each other, but the sides with one are not congruent to the sides with two. So AD and BC both have two arrows, so they're parallel to each other, but they're not parallel to the sides AB and DC because those sides only have one arrow. So AD is parallel to BC. Also, opposite angles are congruent. Opposite angles are congruent. So these two angles are congruent, and these two angles are congruent. So that means angle A is congruent to angle C, angle D is congruent to angle B. Then we have consecutive angles are supplementary. So remember, supplementary are angles that add up to 180 degrees. So consecutive angles are supplementary. So we can say that the measure of angle A plus the measure of angle D equals 180 degrees. And the measure of angle C plus the measure of angle B is 180 degrees. Because remember, consecutive angles are like same side interior angles. So A and D are consecutive. They're right next to each other. And B and C are consecutive angles. Then the last property is that the diagonals are bisected. So the diagonals are bisected, which means cut in half. So if we look at our picture up here, if we draw the diagonals, oh, that's terrible. They cut each other in half. So what that means is that if we call this intersection point E, that DE and BE are congruent to each other, and AE and CE are congruent to each other. Now, the two diagonals themselves, the whole diagonals, are not necessarily congruent to each other, but where our two diagonals intersect, that cuts each of the diagonals in half. So if we were to write this out, we would say that AE is congruent to CE, and DE is congruent to BE. Right, so if a shape is a parallelogram, then all of these properties are true that we see drawn here and written below. So it's important that you have this easily accessible, so that way when you're given a parallelogram, you can quickly see all the properties that we have. So if we look on the next page, we're going to use these properties to solve some problems. So it says solve for the missing variables. I'm going to solve for x first. Those two sides are opposite, so that means those two sides must be congruent. So 37 is equal to 2x minus 3. And what I found helpful, just for the first little bit, is to kind of give yourself a note on the side. Why are you writing this? Like, why am I setting these two things equal to each other? And that's because the opposite sides are congruent. So then we can solve this. So we get 40 equals 2x. Divide both sides by 2. X equals 20. Okay, so now with y, I see this angle L is 120. This angle N is y. Those are opposite angles. So that means y is also equal to 123 degrees. And that's because opposite angles are congruent. Yeah, and after a while, you won't need to write this reasoning. Like I said, it just helps for the first couple times so that you can really remember the properties. And then the last one, those two angles are consecutive interior angles, or consecutive angles, so they add to 180. So 123 plus z equals 180, and that is because consecutive angles add to 180 degrees. So then we'll solve that. Subtract 123 from both sides, and we get z equals 57 degrees. Okay, example number 2 says one angle of a parallelogram is 20 degrees more than the other angle. Find the measure of both angles using algebra. So let's draw a picture. So we have a parallelogram, and we don't know what any of the angles are. So let's just make one of them x. Well, in a parallelogram, the opposite angles are congruent, so that means this one is x as well. The problem then says that one angle is 20 degrees more than the other. So that means these two angles have to be x plus 20, because that is 20 degrees more than the angle x. So we know that these two angles are consecutive angles. So x plus 20 equals 180. And that's because consecutive angles add to 180. So let's combine our like terms. And then subtract 20 from both sides. 2x equals 160. Divide by 2. X is equal to 80. Well, the problem says find the measure of both angles. So these two angles are 80, which would make the other angles, my purple ones, 80 plus 20, or 100. Example number 3 says find the value of each variable in the parallelogram. And now we're dealing with the diagonals. Remember, in the diagonals of a parallelogram, they bisect each other. So that means 12 is equal to 3x plus 6. Again, that's because diagonals bisect each other. So we'll solve that. We'll subtract 6 from both sides. We get 6 equals 3x. Divide both sides by 3. We get x is equal to 2. Then the other diagonal, we're going to do 2y plus 9 equals 27. And that's the same reason as we had up here, because the diagonals bisect each other. So then we will subtract 9 from both sides. We get 2y equals 18. Divide by 2. And we get y is equal to 9. So you can see that once you get the equation set up, that this isn't really too difficult. Again, don't just think, oh, I'm going to put everything equal to each other and hope for the best, because that will work a large amount of the time. But when you get a situation when that doesn't work, like example number 2 here, you're going to get the wrong answer and you're not really going to know why. So really use the properties on this page to determine, do I set these things equal to each other or do they add to 180 degrees? The last problem, there's a lot going on here, so let's really try to focus and only solve for what we need to solve for. So the first one right here, 21, says find the length of HI. Well, HI is this. And that's going to be congruent to the other opposite side of KJ. And opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent, so this is 16. Okay, number 22, KH. KH is this side. Well, in a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent, so IJ over here is 10. So that means this side is 10 as well. Then we have GH. GH is this side right here. And this is the other part of the diagonal. And remember, diagonals bisect each other. So if this is 8, this must be 8 as well. And then HJ is this whole length right here. So 8 plus 8 is 16. So now let's look at the angles. We have the measure of angle KIH. So here's KIH. That's this angle right here. Well, if I compare that to this angle down here, those two angles are alternate interior angles. They're both inside the parallelogram, and KI is my transversal. So that means that this angle up here must also be 28 degrees. Number 26, let me erase this stuff. So that's a measure of angle JIH. So JIH. So this whole angle here. Now, the way that I'm going to solve this is to look at all of my angles here. This 84, this 23, this 28, and this part right here that I don't know. If I find that little part that I don't know, then I can add that little part to 28, and that would give me the whole angle. Well, these angles, these four smaller angles right here, must add up to 180 degrees, because those are consecutive angles as well. So let me do that. Let me do 84 plus 23 plus 28 equals 180. Oops, sorry, plus x, because we're trying to figure out one of the angles. All right, so then I'm going to get my calculator. I'm going to add up 84 plus 23 plus 28, and I get 135. So 135 plus x equals 180. Subtract 135 from both sides. X is 45. So this smaller angle right here is 45 degrees. So now that whole angle, that orange angle that I have, is going to be 45 plus 28, or 73 degrees. So then what we can also do is kind of fill in some of the other angles here. If this angle is 45, that means this angle is also 45. And then down here, if this angle is 23, this one's also got to be 23. And then that one has to be 84. So now we can go look at our problem. The measure of KJI, is that whole angle there, 84 plus 23, which is 107. The measure of HKI, which is this angle here that we calculated was 45 degrees. The measure of angle HGI. So HGI is talking about this angle right here. Now, we don't know what that angle is. There's nothing there. But you see my triangle right here in yellow or orange. This triangle, all the angles add up to 180. So one angle is 23. Another angle is 28. So we can add x to it and set it equal to 180. And that will give me my angle that I'm trying to find. So if I add up my like terms, 23 and 28, I get 51 plus x equals 180. So x would be 129. So this angle right here is 129 degrees. And then the last part, this number 30, HGK. HGK. This angle right here. Well, I already have a straight line right here. And one angle is 129. So if I do 180 minus 129, that gives me 51. That gives me this angle here. So yeah, that was a lot of work for all this. You know, we had to figure out a piece here and there and kind of build off of one part to get the next. So it's very important that you understand these properties and that you have your notes with you so you can refer to them when need be. So this is it for parallelograms. Next time we will talk about some more specific parallelograms and the properties that that apply to those shapes. So thank you for watching the video. Make sure you like it and subscribe.